Yes, indeed. The United States has sent us a letter with measures that will come into effect if there is no negotiated solution. So we will also extend the suspension of our countermeasures until August. And at the same time, we will continue to prepare further countermeasures to be fully prepared. Trump drops tariff bomb on allies. Financial markets will face a test on Monday after U.S. President Donald Trump announced 30% tariffs on the European Union and Mexico, which will take effect on August 1st. Trump stepped up trade measures, promising that the new tariffs would affect everyone from Canada to Brazil to Algeria, while calling on trading partners to renegotiate. Despite warnings from figures such as JP Morgan CEO Jamie Dimon, investors have so far behaved as if they believe Trump will eventually back down, as has happened many times with his administration. Investors should not hope that Trump is just bluffing with his threat to impose a 30% tariff on European goods, Brian Jacobson, chief economist at Annex Wealth Management, wrote in an email. This level of duties is punitive, but it is likely to be painful for Europe, not the United States. So time is running out. Bitcoin, which has been trading even on weekends, has barely reacted to Trump's latest statements, although it recently reached a historic high. Currency markets, which will open at 5 a.m. Sydney time, will provide an additional assessment of the impact on global risk appetite of Trump. The euro hit its highest level against the dollar since 2021 this month as investors assessed growth prospects in the region. The EU tried to conclude a preliminary trade agreement with the United States to avoid higher tariffs, but Trump dashed the last hopes in Brussels. However, the U.S. president left a window for possible adjustments. As always, there are many conditions and clauses that could allow these rates to be lowered, Jacobson said. It's probably why the markets aren't thrilled with the tax-related statements. This is not the first time that financial markets have tried to figure out how to assess Trump's confusing tariff campaign in his second term. Although markets reacted aggressively on April 2nd, Liberation Day, selling risky assets and even U.S. bonds, most of these movements have now disappeared as the president has put aside most of his earlier threats. Even when Trump said that August 1st was the final deadline, markets reacted as if the date was still subject to negotiation. On Friday, there were some signs of caution. Stocks fell from record highs, and the dollar had its best week since February. In a letter to Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum, Trump said that the country is helping me secure the border, but that is not enough. The White House clarified that the 30% duty will not apply to goods that comply with the terms of the USMCA agreement. Trump is once again applying a pressure strategy, announcing high-profile tariffs while leaving loopholes for bargaining. This forces other countries to rush to make concessions, but at the same time puts markets in a state of uncertainty, although investors are already accustomed to his maneuvers, and as Bloomberg says, do not panic. And they write that the markets are so unfazed by the tariffs that it makes Trump bolder. U.S. President Donald Trump is talking about tougher duties again. This time he promises to impose a tariff of up to 20% on goods from Canada, Brazil, Algeria, but the stock market has barely reacted. Trump says that the growth of the S&P 500 index of America's largest technology companies is proof that Wall Street supports his policies. However, investors themselves simply do not believe that these threats will be realized. They believe that the president will eventually back down, as he has done in the past. Experts explain, Trump often starts negotiations loudly, but in reality the results are softer. Therefore, the market is not panicking yet. However, analysts warn that even without new duties, the current policy could raise inflation and hit companies' profits. JP Morgan CEO Jamie Dimon warns markets have become overconfident, and the U.S. Treasury Secretary said, "You should not play with Trump." Despite all these statements, Bitcoin or AI stocks continue to grow. Investors are waiting for the corporate reporting season to understand what is happening to the economy. Meanwhile, in June, Americans began to notice that prices were rising again. And the main reason is that companies have begun to pass on the new costs associated with Trump's duties to customers. When the government imposes duties on imported goods, it makes them more expensive. Businesses pay more for imports, and in order not to lose profit, they raise prices for consumers. According to Bloomberg, prices for goods and services, excluding food and fuel, increased by 0.3% over the month. This is the fastest rise in price over the past 5 months. Analysts predict that annual inflation, i.e., how much prices have risen over the past 12 months, will reach almost 3%. The last time this level was seen was in January. Although the growth is still small, economists believe that this may be just the beginning, as the duties have not yet taken full effect. The U.S. labor market has worsened. There are fewer vacancies and people are spending money more cautiously. This makes companies think twice before raising prices because they risk losing customers. The Federal Reserve System has not yet reduced interest rates, i.e., it has not made loans cheaper. They are afraid that if the rates are cut, people will start spending more, which will further accelerate inflation. The next decision on rates will be made on July 29th to 30. Prices are rising not only in the U.S., but also in the UK, EU, Japan, and Canada. Trade is weakening, and politicians are growing more critical of the U.S.'s aggressive customs policy. So, we are seeing tumultuous economic geopolitical events that relate to Trump and everything that is happening around him. Obviously, Trump sees everything that is happening in the context of not just a tariff war, not just an attempt to find economic benefits, but also this attempt can be classified as an attempt to find an ally in the game against China.
А ще й це намагання ми можемо класифікувати як намагання знайти союзника проти гри з
More precisely, even a war, which we can say does not yet smell like one, but there are already certain signals coming in, and Trump's calls for Japan and Australia to decide who they will be with if the United States is at war with China. All these calls are coming in parallel with this trade war.
У разі, якщо Сполучені Штати будуть у війні з Китаєм, всі ці заклики, вони ж лунають абсолютно паралельно цій торговій війні.
And this trade war, these concessions, tracking the reaction of partners whom Trump is constantly betraying but really thinks he is checking.
Так би мовити, зраджує, а направду думає, що перевіряє.
And such a rigorous check of money probably gives him an understanding of who these countries will stand with in case of emergency. On August 1st, Washington imposes 30% tariffs on goods from the EU. There is already a reaction from Ursula von der Leyen and Emmanuel Macron that the EU will have to take retaliatory measures. How do you view Trump's current customs policy? And why did the negotiations that lasted several weeks between the EU and the US not yield any results? Indeed, U.S. President Donald Trump has announced a 30% tariff on European imports starting August 1st, and this could hit a variety of industries. And the European Union has already announced the need for mirror measures in response, and you are right that there has already been a reaction from the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, who reacted to this decision and noted that the 30% tariff on exports is harmful to businesses and consumers on both sides of the Atlantic.
На експорт зашкодить бізнесу і споживачам по обидва боки Атлантики.
There was also a reaction from Bernd Lange, chairman of the European Parliament's Trade Committee, who called Washington's actions a defiant slap in the face and emphasized that countermeasures should come into effect as soon as Monday, he announced.
Вашингтона зухвалим ляпасом і наголосив на тому, що контрзаходи мають набути
The same was the reaction of French President Emmanuel Macron, who called on the European Commission to resolutely defend the interests of the European Union if no agreement is reached by the end of this month. In other words, we see that the negotiations in recent weeks have been quite intense, but they have not yet yielded any tangible results. There is hope that the United States and the European Union will agree on some compromise options that will suit all parties to the maximum extent possible. And it should be understood that the European Union was already ready to make symbolic concessions or some quotas, but not to completely change the standards and other aspects that are in place.
Європейський Союз вже був готовий піти на символічні поступки чи деякі квоти, але не на повну зміну тих стандартів і інших аспектів, які мають місце.
In other words, we see that it is really very difficult for the parties to find a common denominator so that they can agree to avoid such a tough tariff war.
Щоб уникнути такої жорсткої, фактично тарифної війни.
Now, I think we can expect a series of negotiations, but we should understand that the United States has a strong protectionist policy now. Donald Trump is playing the card of protecting American farmers and jobs and so on. This is true for many sectors of the American economy. And the European Union, for its part, fears a precedent if, for example, it gives the United States some kind of preference which would hit the internal single market. And, of course, this can be an example for other players in the world. This is a very serious problem, and the parties obviously want to resolve it, but we cannot say whether it will be possible before August 1st. But there is a risk of a trade war with new duties on both sides.
Не можемо, але є ризик переростання у торгову війну із новими митами з обох боків.
This is important for Trump, of course, because he has repeatedly stated and taken various actions to impose such tough restrictions on certain countries or international organizations such as the European Union.
Жорсткі обмеження проти тих чи інших країн чи міжнародних організацій, таких як Європейський Союз.
And it seems to me that Donald Trump's team would like to have some kind of a big deal before the U.S. congressional elections in 2026 to demonstrate a tougher line, but he is defending his own interests with the European Union, and it is too early to talk about any such big deal, although it is possible that some way out of this difficult situation will be found by August 1st, because then both the U.S. and the European Union will obviously suffer.
І поки що про якусь таку велику угоду зарано говорити, хоча не виключається, що до 1 серпня все ж таки будуть віднайдені якісь шляхи виходу із цієї непростої ситуації, тому що тоді постраждають, очевидно, дійсно і США, і Європейський Союз.
And this will be used, perhaps by third countries or other international actors, but it is possible that the European Union will seek other partners. And here, of course, first of all, it is worth mentioning a country like China, which can, for its part, improve some conditions for European goods and so on.
Скажімо, до інших партнерів, і тут, звісно, перш за все варто згадати про державу як Китай, який може зі свого боку покращити якісь умови для європейських товарів і тому подібне.
Of course, if the European Union does the same with respect to goods from China, it will bring the European Union and China even closer together.
Саме Європейський Союз та КНР.
And this could hit the reputation of the United States, the reputation of Donald Trump himself, who would rather isolate China in the international economic arena, and he could create conditions for more demand for goods from China and more trade relations with the People's Republic of China in general, which is obviously not part of the plans of the Donald Trump administration.
Відносин більше потребувати у світі саме з Китайською Народною Республікою, що, вочевидь, не входить в плани адміністрації Дональда Трампа.
And we must realize that these are risks for Ukraine. In fact, this will not allow China to strengthen its positions. For its part, it may increase cooperation with the Russian Federation, and this may hit us in the context of, for example, increased hostilities and attacks by the Russian Federation, which will have an even stronger partner if we are talking about China.
З боку Російської Федерації, яка, скажімо так, матиме ще більш сильного партнера в якості, якщо ми говоримо саме про Китай.
Although, in principle, this is not very beneficial for Russia, because in fact it becomes even more dependent on China and becomes even less of a partner, given that China is actually becoming the leader not only of the axis of evil, but also the leader of the countries of the global south, which can unite many different states around it, and even to some extent depend on the European Union, which may be looking for new markets, new opportunities, and so on.
Який може згуртувати навколо себе дуже багато різних держав, і навіть, скажімо так, певною мірою узалежнити від себе країни Європейського Союзу, які можуть шукати нові ринки збуту, нові можливості і тому подібне.
In other words, we see that Donald Trump's actions can actually harm global trade and the global economy and destroy those established ties.
Світовій торгівлі, світовій економіці і зруйнувати ті усталені зв'язки.
For example, if we are talking about the United States, the European Union, which have existed for many decades. At the same time, we are now seeing that Donald Trump can find more than $3 billion to help Ukraine while using another $5 billion of Russian assets that are currently in the United States. In your opinion, can this be an impetus for Europe to resolve the issue of frozen assets, which are much larger than, for example, those in the United States, and transfer them, respectively, to Ukraine?
Більше, ніж, до прикладу, на рахунках в Сполучених Штатах, і передачу їх, відповідно, на користь Україні.
Yes, there is a lot of discussion about the frozen Russian assets, a smaller part of which is in the United States, the larger part in the European Union, and there is already a practice of using the interest that comes from frozen assets, but there is still no consensus on whether these assets themselves can be touched, and now, unfortunately, there are more opposition to this so as not to create any negative precedents and to avoid any lawsuits from the Russian Federation and so on.
Щодо того, чи можна все ж таки трогати самі ці капітали, і зараз, на жаль, більше виступів проти цього, щоб, власне, не створити якісь негативні прецеденти, і щоб не було якихось позовів з боку Російської Федерації і тому подібне.
That is, now we are talking more about continuing to implement the initiatives that we had earlier in the context of using the interest from frozen Russian assets, but the work is certainly ongoing. And it is possible that there will be some positive developments, but again, it depends on what the situation will be in the near future.
Відсотків із заморожених російських активів, але робота, звісно, триває і не виключається, що все ж таки будуть якісь позитивні зрушення, але знову ж таки це залежить від того, яка буде ситуація найближчим часом.
If, for example, the Russian Federation agrees to negotiate, but in a format that would allow for some compromise solutions in the context of ending active hostilities, then we can hardly expect that the European Union and the United States will then try to use the frozen Russian assets, the main body, where the money that is currently frozen is.
То навряд чи можна очікувати, що потім Європейський Союз і Сполучені Штати Америки будуть намагатися використовувати заморожені російські активи, саме тіло основне, там ті гроші, які зараз є в заморозці.
And if not, if the Russian Federation continues its aggression against Ukraine, this hot phase, and if it is clear to everyone that Putin is not going to stop, neither this year nor in the future, then I think there will be more votes for finding a way to use these frozen Russian assets for the benefit of the Ukrainian state, both to strengthen the security of our country and, of course, to restore the economy, infrastructure, and so on, because it is a lot of money and it can really go to important things.
Заморожені російські активи використати на користь української держави як для посилення безпеки нашої країни, так і, звісно, для відновлення економіки, інфраструктури і тому подібне, тому що це великі кошти, і вони дійсно можуть піти на важливі справи.
So I think that the coming weeks or months will show in which direction the policy of both the United States and the European Union will move with regard to frozen Russian assets. All of this depends, of course, on the ongoing negotiations, but we see that they have reached a dead end.
Контексту від переговорного контексту, який зараз триває, але бачимо, що фактично він зайшов у глухий кут.
There is news that Japan and the European Union are planning to create their own satellite network, as well as cooperate in the defense industry to reduce dependence on the United States. This is stated with reference to a draft agreement that is being prepared for adoption at the Japan-EU summit on July 23rd in Tokyo. This just confirms the point you are making, or even the line of behavior you are highlighting. Is this a small story, or is it still fundamental? If they are preparing such cooperation, if they are systematically turning away from the United States, then what does this say? About a new military alliance or something? In any case, there is the NATO alliance, which is obliged to respond in one way or another. And if something happens, how will these satellites work, these options for reducing dependence on the United States? This is not a very clear scheme. I can still make a certain assumption that it is not only related to the security sphere, but it is also related to the economic sphere. We can see that Mr. Trump has launched a new wave of customs warfare with his partners, allies, and in general around the world. And it is quite possible that now, due to the security factor, allies and partners simply want to show the United States that military presence and military power, military alliances, and everything related to the security sector should be coordinated with economic policy. And so now, I think that such information scandal, such turbulence, will occur precisely as a reaction to the steps taken by Washington. But then again, as Trump himself has shown, in such a situation, in principle, he can take a step forward and then immediately cool down a bit and take a step back. The question here is whether the institutions themselves, the conventional deep state, which the 47th U.S. president is fighting so hard against, will do their best to minimize the direct negative impact of such turbulence on official Washington. But again, if we go back to the global situation, this activity of the United States in principle can also be related to, for example, scenarios, forecasts from the intelligence community regarding further actions of China itself. And China's partners in the near future, including the Russian Federation. That is, now, based on a certain tension, even historicity, what we are seeing now may even be about the nearer term, and not as the scenarios were written for the Russian Federation, that an attack on NATO countries, 2029, 2030. We remember that earlier when it came to China, we were talking about intelligence data and forecasts based on this data for 2026, 2027. And based on the active bet on drones and the fact that now, for example, in China alone, it's just a regular show, a civilian theme. Everyone applauds. 12,000 drones swarm to draw all sorts of things in the sky. Where these 12,000 drones are operating at the same time, we all understand perfectly well how these technologies are then scaled to the security dimension. And then there will be the question of aviation in general, and as for the Navy, even satellites, to what extent the United States can continue to respond. That is why we are now actually facing a very serious military and technological leap. Ukraine, by the way, is at the forefront of this leap, and we understand both the positive and negative aspects of this process, but again, this is fueling a certain controversy in the world. And in particular, what we are discussing in general about Asia. We have one more topic and one more region to discuss with you. This is Europe and what is happening there. Telegram channels are now reporting that in 2024, the EU spent more on purchasing Russian gas than on helping Ukraine. They refer to the European Commissioner for Energy. Of course, he calls it a paradox. We also have words for what we would like to call it, but we probably shouldn't say such words on the air. So we will stick to a certain logic and culture. But actually, today I was reading one of the analytical materials on sanctions. And they say that the story of sanctions has developed enough, even evolved, that it is now being compared even to anti-corruption legislation. That is, they will now be checking where certain parts go and to whom they go. And this is no longer the responsibility of any institutions, but of the companies that sell certain materials. And this serious evolution is probably leading us to a situation where Europe is already economically building a Great Wall, not a Chinese wall, but probably a European wall with Russia. And this is very serious, probably if it really works as they say. But this news, like what we're hearing from the European Commissioner, feels somewhat like trying to catch your breath before death, meaning they're trying to catch their breath. They stock up on these goods while they can, then realize it's too late. We must also understand that business is always about making money. No one is really interested in the geopolitical situation or the security situation. Objectively speaking, this is true. There is always competition between national goals and the political situation and business in general. Doing business as usual, we remember this topic, business as usual with Russians. Many companies that are trying to lobby for the situation in Germany and in the United States, as we remember, the great businessman Lynch, who bought out certain companies, are just connected with the northern streams in order to immediately get on the stream. These streams, as soon as the opportunity arises, will agree with the Russians, create a scheme together with the Americans to supply the relevant bloody energy and gas to Europe, to the European Union.
На ці потоки, як тільки з'явиться можливість домовляться, умовно кажучи, з росіянами, створять разом з американцями схему постачання відповідних кривавих енергоносіїв і газу, відповідно, в Європу, в Європейський Союз.
And it is very good that Germany has once again emphasized that it is all about the Nord Streams, but their fate is such that they will not be restored under any circumstances. But in general, of course, yes, there is a paradox, 200 billion euros for Russian energy, but we also have to understand that this has already happened. The question is, what is being done to reduce the use and stop using these Russian energy resources altogether? What programs are in place and whether these programs are stalling? We are seeing an active conflict between Ursula von der Leyen, the European Commission in general, and, for example, Hungary and Slovakia, who are trying their best to block the desire to abandon Russian energy carriers in 2027-2028 within the European Union as a whole. Our two neighbors tell that it turns out that national sovereignty is being violated. How can this be? They will not be able to buy Russian energy. Instead of fighting to open up opportunities for other players, for Norway, for the United States, for Qatar, for North Africa, there are many opportunities. No, certain politicians like Orban need to preserve everything, to do everything possible so that, God forbid, they do not lose these corruption opportunities to enrich their environment. And this shows that there is a certain corruption needle that Russia has been planting, and the Soviet Union also planted in its time. That is, this story has been going on for decades, and unfortunately, even the accession of many countries to the European Union did not completely destroy these ties. But this does not mean that they cannot be destroyed. In general, I believe that we should probably start raising the issue of shutting down the Druzhba pipeline. It operates through the territory of Ukraine solely because, as was the case with gas transit at one time, we have specific obligations to our European counterparties. But we also have to say publicly that enough is enough. This is really blood money. We must at least publicly state our position on this clearly and demand that the European Commission and our partners close this topic and this shop as soon as possible. Why did the Czechs do it now when they also use this oil? The Polish Orlen, which has its factories in the Czech Republic, refused. They said, "That's it, no more Russian oil." And this is a very good example to follow. I think that it is quite possible that further waves of sanctions restrictions will require more active discussion of the issue of complete abandonment of Russian energy carriers in general. And, by the way, nuclear power should be included here as well, because Ukraine is a good example of how even Soviet blocs can run on American nuclear fuel without any problems.